Hi, it's Jim. Thank you for joining me. I've often heard people ask, if there's only one truth, why are there so many religions? I'm offering a thought process here to help understand answers to that question. This will be a slide presentation rather than a video, with some visual metaphors to help understand, why are there so many religions? I've added a few slides at the end to share some lessons from experience on applying this information in practice. This whole topic can get complicated pretty fast, so I'm going to narrow the scope a bit while addressing the substantive content. We generally commingle aspects of family and tradition into our sense of religious identity. At first we get our religion, or no religion, from our families, and those bring along culture and practices. I'm going to leave those two categories to the anthropologists and sociologists, and just focus on the spiritual content. You'll see what I mean by spiritual content over the next few slides. I'm going to start with a passage from the Bible that turns out to be a sort of Rosetta Stone for understanding the structure of the spiritual world as experienced by humans. Variations on these words appear in numerous places, but the words from the book of Mark may be the most complete and will serve our purpose in considering basic spiritual structure. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. I'm going to take the liberty of rearranging the order, so now this is what we have. The basic levels for individual and historical spiritual progress can be traced to these four words: strength, heart, mind, soul. Conveniently, these can also be used to understand spiritual differences in the world's religions. Let's see how. The spiritual essentials of religion are made up of combinations of these four elements in different proportions. Each religion or denomination tends to focus on one of these fundamental elements. As far as I can tell, none focuses on all of them in equal measure. It may not be surprising to you that the first level of monotheism is built around the concept of spiritual law. The connection to strength or might is, it's what you do or don't do, which amounts to a striving for moral righteousness. The second level is based on faith, which is more than just belief. Faith is trust in unseen good. Faith is beyond behavior, for as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Now we've seen a framework emerging that helps us understand the basics of some of the most prominent monotheistic religions on the planet. The next two levels include what are sometimes called the metaphysical religions, and these focus on spiritual understanding and spiritual oneness. For completeness, we will also include one level that precedes monotheism. The next slide puts these all together and adds a few more descriptive words. I've added a ground level to the other four because the starting point of all religious practice is spiritual awareness, simply paying attention to spiritual things. Until this awareness embraces spiritual law, it is primarily practiced through observances, ceremonies, and rituals. Monotheism introduces spiritual law. This level is behavior-based, focused on obedience and discipline, with the deity as a lawgiver, often a stern lawgiver. The next level is faith-based, which involves belief, love, faith, and trust. The deity is seen as benevolent, if not completely dominant. After that comes emphasis on spiritual understanding, which instead of a personal deity is based on a divine mind or principle as deity. What may be the final level focuses on deity as infinite, with an emphasis on the wholeness and oneness of spiritual identity. Obviously, this analysis is a broad brush approach, handling the subject in outline, as there are surely multitudes of books written about each of these levels. This next slide shows a simple model for using this framework to portray proportional distributions of these attributes that can be used to describe, in a general way, any of the world's religions, using the musical scale as a visual metaphor. I'm going to avoid naming any actual religions in these examples because my interest is in offering a method for each to understand, rather than highlighting any particular denominations. Looking at these steps, we see that they begin with spiritual awareness, which can be grouped in what are generally called earth-based religions. When spiritual law is introduced, religions become more behavior-based. The level after that is faith-based, focusing on belief, trust, and love. The two levels after that, the metaphysical religions, emphasize spiritual understanding, and then meditations on the oneness of the infinite. The thing that makes this initially seem complicated is that most religions are a mix of some number of these factors. Once familiar with these levels, it's not difficult to think about any religion you might be familiar with and see what combinations of these characteristics might best describe it. For illustration, off the top of my head, I've imagined how I might portray a few significant religions. You can try this yourself by characterizing a few different religions using the 5 levels we have just reviewed. For instance, example 4 at the bottom right would be a religion that has earth-based origins with rituals and ceremonies, but also has emphasis on self-discipline, as well as meditations on oneness, while skipping over explicit focus on faith or spiritual understanding. It's not unusual for religions that emphasize higher levels to skip steps to get there. These patterns are not fluid, but rather tend to maintain a certain stratified stability. Denominations, as well as individuals, tend to find the level they are most comfortable with, where they tend to stay, unless they encounter significant spiritual evolution or impulsion to go higher. In these diagrams, I've used eighth notes for simplicity, but one could use from whole notes to 16th notes to document a more granular analysis. Now this slide completes the response to the question, why so many religions? While not completely definitive, it does provide insights into why it would take a combination of many denominations to cover the whole content. We are sometimes able to find resonance with partial constellations of these 5 elements, but grasping the whole scope may initially draw us far beyond our normal way of looking at things. The next 4 slides address more challenging questions about how we might use these levels in practice. I found that this train is a useful way to understand what makes our spiritual progress go. Imagining ourselves climbing on the train and making our way from the caboose up to the engine. As you may recall, it all starts with paying attention to the spiritual dimension, shown by our stick figure, watching and waving as the train goes by. At some point, one may make a decision to get on the train, that is, to begin to embrace spiritual law, The thing about this train is, to get on, you may have to leave some baggage behind. I used to think that when one had mastered any particular level, the previous levels would naturally fall into line. Alas, this has not been the case. Through experience, I've found that sometimes a conscious effort is required. For instance, to bring behavior into line with beliefs, or to bring beliefs into line with insights from spiritual understanding. As one progresses, there's a need to keep the cars linked together. Otherwise, what might look like progress may not bring the fruits of progress. I've also learned from practice that you can never be completely successful at any of the lower levels. For instance, while discipline and obedience are indispensable to spiritual growth, you can't actually obey your way into the kingdom of heaven. Spiritual discipline is a necessary but not sufficient condition. You can get well along at any level, but then, in order to progress, you need to go up higher. Perhaps you can get to maybe 75 or 80% along any level, and then your progress slows and stops. At that point, the only way to continue to progress is to go up higher. One reason for this is if you could solve the problem of being by obedience or by faith alone, you would have no incentive to continue moving upward in the scale of being. At its extremes, obedience and the quest for moral righteousness can turn into self-righteousness and severity, while putting too much weight on faith without understanding can lead to reliance on blind faith. When you get to the top, it's not game over, but having new perspective and empowerment to see spiritual causation flow back through understanding, faith, and behavior to embrace experience. We've been slow to realize that these basic steps aren't just steps on the stairs. They're also links in a chain. Considering this progression from paying attention to obedience and discipline, to love and faith, to spiritual understanding, and to embracing infinity as identity, reminds me of something I used to say elsewhere in my career. And it certainly applies here too. If you're not overwhelmed, you don't understand. If engagement in each level is the goal, how is this even possible? Well, as Jesus said to his disciples, with men this is impossible. And then he said, but with God all things are possible. And I might add, and with practice. Thank you for following along. I hope some of this has made sense. If you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to write them in the comments section. Until next time, bye-bye.